Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today, I am going to be discussing my analysis of the entire first movement of Brahms' Second Piano Concerto. I know this will be a long one, so I've time-stamped important sections of the video if you need to pause to collect yourself. Also, I want to let you know I'm using a reduced score for two pianos of this concerto that was created by Brahms to present this analysis. The orchestra is so large, the full score was just too hard to be seen on a screen, and the chord symbols were too squashed at the bottom. The recording is of Clifford Curzon playing with the Vienna Philharmonic, which is a favorite recording of mine, but will, of course, be copyright claimed immediately. If you'd like to offset the impossibility of this channel ever earning ad revenue due to my preference of using high-quality recordings and the inability of recording companies to recognize what does and doesn't fall under fair use education exceptions, and would prefer to support me rather than a megacorporation greedily profiting off the performances of musicians who are, in fact, dead, then you can do so by joining my Patreon for any amount. Even $1 is helpful. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Let's discuss a little of the background of this piece before we get a little theoretical. This concerto was composed over the course of 3 years and completed in 1881. It was dedicated to Brahms' first piano teacher, Edward Markson, who was himself in a pedagogical family tree with Mozart. Brahms premiered the piece in Budapest and toured it that same year, along with his first piano concerto and the Academic Festival Overture. The second concerto is often viewed as a counterpart to his first piano concerto. Both works are Olympian in size, but the second concerto is generally considered to be a blend of the symphonic principle and the concerto. As we'll see, some interesting aspects of the form of the first movement even show this combination of genres. This concerto's form is often obscured and made ambiguous by developmental virtuosic displays, but against that cloudy backdrop, moments of dazzling thematic clarity appear, and I'm excited to walk through this piece with you. It begins on a small, almost chamber scale, with the French horn playing the principal theme. Although I do consider this concerto to be in dialogue with the classical type 5 form, or concerto form, as you can see, Brahms is opening the piece by going against the concerto idea. Although the soloist is accompanying the theme rather than presenting it, I am labeling this section as a soloist interjection. The primary theme will make many reappearances over the course of this sonata, but there is no primary theme specific to Ritornello sections. All the P themes in this piece will be the P 1.1 and 1.2 that are presented in this section. Brahms follows this with a brief cadenza which links the soloist interjection with Ritornello 1. Julian Horton, in his book named after this concerto, where he attempts to set forth guidelines for 19th century concerti generally, this concerto specifically, and even post-Brahms concerti, writes that the inclusion of a cadenza at this point in the work might actually be considered anti-virtuosic. I'm shortening and paraphrasing this quote a bit. Horton's book would have been greatly improved by more intense editing. He writes that the most striking interpolation in this concerto is the cadenza. If the omission of the ending cadenza, which takes place somewhat outside of the form, by virtuoso composers of the 19th century is in response to the proliferation of those skilled performers, a point which Horton makes in chapter 4 of this book, then its inclusion in the primary theme section is paradoxically anti-virtuosic. The 19th century was a time when instrumental skill first began to blossom, and virtuosity was becoming more and more commonplace. In response to this, the cadenza, especially the improvisatory cadenza of the 18th century, was becoming a thing of the past. Horton is arguing that its inclusion with this structured part of the form does not separate the soloist from the ensemble, but rather combines them into something more unified. Horton uses the term interpolation, but I feel the term interjection is more appropriate. I think of an interpolation as something which is occurring simultaneously with the music, such as the D minor interpolation I've included here, one of many sections which can be analyzed in both a major and minor key. Whereas an interjection I think specifically of as halting the action and interjecting a point. That's what I consider to be happening in this opening primary theme. The transition which follows this cadenza is also the beginning of Ritornello 1. As you may remember from my analysis of Mozart's 17th Piano Concerto, Type 5 sonata forms are not only labeled with P, TR, S, and C, but are also labeled by where those themes occur. Themes will have a designation of Ritornello 1, R1, followed by P, TR, S, or C, or Solo 1, followed by those same themes, depending on whether they are introduced in the Ritornello or soloist sections. There's a key for abbreviations in the description below if you lose track of what these various letters stand for. It's this transition which is initially in dialogue with the more symphonic Type 3 sonata. The initial Ritornello exposition of a concerto form should not modulate, but as you'll see, this transition heads towards a medial caesura, which is a half cadence in the dominant key. Although the Elements of Sonata Theory is specifically about 18th century sonata forms, with some extensions into the early 19th century, mainly Beethoven and Schubert, Hepokoski and Darcy actually discussed this deformation in their chapters on Type 5 sonatas, and it was occasionally a part of Mozart's Type 5 practice. Essentially, the initial 5 medial caesura hints at the symphonic, and the correction of this tonal era reinforces the piece's concerto-ness. Hepokoski and Darcy write that it is as if the work itself is saying, no, this is a concerto, not a symphony. Brahms' music attempts to correct this lapse in the Caesura Fill which follows. Try to count along without looking at the score, and you'll see that not only is this section tonally unstable, but metrically unstable as well. The beat is obscured by these syncopations. However, perhaps to highlight the struggle and near synthesis of the form of a symphony and concerto, the music gets lost along the way. Brahms has failed to present a secondary theme in the tonic, and this Ritornello 1 secondary theme can be analyzed in the mediant D minor, with all the tragic implications of that key. The secondary theme proceeds, teetering back and forth between the tonic major and the mediant minor, before reaching this setup for a structural cadence, a dominant chord in D minor. However, the orchestra refuses to allow this, and there is silence in the ensuing beat here. Regathering itself, the orchestra plays a new theme. I've chosen to label it as S1.2, and the reason why, instead of as a C theme, will become clear in the soloist's exposition. But it doesn't appear that there is a structural cadence anywhere on the horizon. As you may remember, there are a number of ways in which the structural cadences of Type 5 sonata forms can be obscured. If, for example, after a suitable cadential candidate, either soloist or ritornello introduces more secondary theme material, this considerably weakens or even erases the previous candidate for structural cadence. In this section, however, I think it would be fair to say that there is no structural cadence. Although this S1.2 theme will be structurally important later on, its attempt to open a structural cadence in 3 is thwarted by the reappearance of the tonic P theme, which is functioning as a closing zone. Although this is a deceptive cadence, Brahms is introducing a note of ambiguity with a sonic trick you often find in Schubert's music, a composer Brahms was intimately familiar with. Although clearly in the tonic major, this has the unstable sound of the minor mode. This is because the section heavily emphasizes the third of the major chord D, which always adds instability, but also the primary theme itself, without the accompaniment, is in D minor. It's only the addition of the pedal B flat that places it in the tonic major. Although there is an eventual cadence in D minor here, it is squarely within the closing zone, and therefore not a candidate for structural cadence. The first rotation included a soloist interjection and Ritornello 1, playing with the symphonic form and ultimately failing to reach cadence, placing a heavy load on the shoulders of the soloist exposition, which opens with a link between the rotations. This is a common practice of Mozart's piano concerti. The Soloist 1 presentation of P1.1 is much larger and more developmental than its original presentation in S interjection. The soloist seems fixated on actually reaching a tonic cadence in P1.1, rather than the HC in the initial interjection set up by the harp-like rolling chords of the pianist. When the soloist does manage to reach a weak, imperfect cadence here, the orchestra quickly rushes in to negate the cadential effect and continue P1.1 before transitioning to P1.2. Initially a wind chorale, it's now voiced entirely in the strings. Although the Ritornello 1 transition used the entire primary theme, the soloist iteration is fixated on only the second half of the theme. You may have noticed that although this transition is clearly headed towards a medial caesura in F major, which echoes the material used in Ritornello 1, the entry of the piano seems to obscure this tonality. Rather than a new secondary theme in the desirous dominant key presented by the soloist, we have a Ritornello interjection. In my mind, this Ritornello interjection retroactively explains and is a reflection of the initial solo interjection. In a typical Type 5 sonata form, the primary theme is almost exclusively the prerogative of the Ritornello, but the soloist in this concerto usurped that role. Here, in the soloist exposition, the initial secondary theme would likewise be exclusively tied to the soloist and its rotations, but as if in retaliation, the Ritornello interjects its own secondary theme in a far less desirable key, the flattened mediant. Although unusual, it's at least in the major mode. Although the theme opens in D-flat major, it quickly devolves into motivic sequences, leading the soloist to resume its rotation and open a second transition. This is fairly normative. Although a trimodular block, an exposition with 2 secondary themes and 2 medial caesuras, is unusual in type 1, 2, 3, or 4 sonatas, in a type 5, it is actually a first-level default. I also want to remind you, although sonata theory typically labels trimodular block sections as TMB 1, 2, and 3, I prefer to label them as S1, TR2, and S2. I feel the TMB label doesn't tell you how those sections function, whereas S and TR have established meanings that we're all familiar with. I wouldn't say Brahms is really articulating a second medial caesura here. There are several candidates for its placement, but none of them are the normative harmonic options of perfect or half cadences. But the material which precedes the key change into F minor has the feeling of Caesura Fill to me, and it seems to hopefully direct the soloist towards the major mode. Perhaps in retaliation for absconding with its own secondary theme, however, the soloist's presentation of Ritornello 1's secondary theme is virtuosic and stormy, the piano practically becoming a self-contained orchestra on its own. The question we need to be asking is whether this theme can undo the cadential missteps of the Ritornello's exposition. Is a structural cadence in the minor mode, with all its tragic implications, better than no cadence at all? Although the soloist opens the same empty space between S1.1 and S1.2, the empty rest where the desirous cadence should be is circled in blue, we do eventually come to a perfect authentic cadence. However, the minor 5 cadence is elided with the unique solo 1 closing theme, which, to my ear, considerably weakens its rhetorical strength, even if it is still structurally viable. As you can see on this chart, although there have been some major exceptions to the tonal layout and a couple of soloist and ritornello interjections along the way, Brahms has generally adhered to the Mozartian layout for a type 5, which means up next we have Ritornello 2, which typically closes the soloist exposition and opens the development. Ritornello 2, however, has the power to reinforce the soloist structural cadence by articulating a simple closing zone, most often the C theme heard in R1, or to negate the soloist's EEC by introducing more secondary themes. The soloist is falling into the same trap as Ritornello 1. In bars 173 to 4, Brahms opens a huge cadential gesture, which is again subverted by a deceptive cadence. D-flat appears and sounds in the same tonally unstable major mode. Rather than reaching an actual PAC and thus providing us with at least rhetorical closure, if not structural, the reintroduction of the secondary theme by Ritornello 2 actually erases the structural cadence which occurred earlier. Although there is a classical precedence for this, as Hepokoski and Darcy write, what's unusual in this concerto is that this second iteration of the secondary theme in closing space does not lead to an EEC alternative, marking this as expositional failure. Although in the classical period this would have been dire in the extreme, it need not be so negative in the late 19th century sonata form. Perhaps a failed exposition is preferable to a successful exposition which cadences in the extremely deformational minor mode. The Solo 2 developmental rotation begins with a new iteration of the primary theme that reflects the darkness of the exposition. It's possible to argue that the Solo 2 sections extends through both the development and the recapitulation of this work. Horton does so in his book on the subject. However, I hear this work as being much more closely linked to the 7-part Ritornello classical structure. Although the soloist will be present for the remainder of the work, I hear the ritornello as returning in sections where the spotlight is off the soloist. Most developmental options are on the table in a Type 5 sonata, with a slight weight in favor of having an entirely new secondary Solo 2 theme be the main focus. But by opening with the primary theme, Brahms is already referencing a rotational development, and therefore eschewing that option. this development is not at all tonally stable, as far as I can tell, there's nothing approaching an authentic cadence, perfect or otherwise. On the largest scale, the development is a colossal expansion of the C7 chord, which, when it finally resolves, will open the pathway for a recapitulation, hopefully, in the tonic. On the smaller scale, you can see the key change on the horizon. Brahms will be dancing back and forth between the hinted at major mediant and the far darker key of the Neapolitan, or flattened 2. He enharmonically respells it to B minor, rather than C flat minor. Although, of course, by the late 19th century, Neapolitan chords appear in major modes as well as minor, their reference to the minor mode continues. This Neapolitan C flat hints at B flat minor. In fact, Brahms is doing this in a way that Tchaikovsky also does, what Dr. David Temperley calls the emissary 6/4 chord. Essentially, Temperley is arguing that the tonic 6/4 can be used in a number of other ways, including as an emissary of a new tonal area. He writes that, "What I wish to draw attention to is the powerful tonal implications of these 6/4 chords. Each chord seems to give a momentary suggestion, a kind of flash, of the corresponding key." I don't disagree with Temperley. I think that this is exactly how the tonic 6/4 chord is used. However, I view it as being a suggestion caused by the strong link between the tonic 6/4 and the dominant chord that it most normatively resolves to. The tonic 6/4 is not an emissary on its own, but rather an emissary as part of the cadential gesture, which culminates in most structural PACs. I would say Temperley's categories of tonic harmony, emissary, or structural cue are merely subcategories of the cadential 6/4. Having said that, I do want to highlight how well this article is written. It's so rare to find an academic piece of writing that is so thoroughly readable, and I would definitely recommend checking it out as well as Dr. Temperley's other writing, which he has kindly made available on his own website, linked in the description to this video. In addition to being an almost certainly entirely coincidental quotation of the song John Brown's Body, as much as I would love to see evidence that Brahms was a revolutionary on par with John Brown, it simply isn't there. John Brown's Body is also the tune of Battle Hymn of the Republic, if your sympathies lie more with a government than an abolitionist hero. This theme is also based on an iteration of the secondary theme that harkens back to Ritornello I's rotation, meaning this development is fully rotational. The tonality is now mostly emphasizing D major and its dominant A major, global 3 and 7 respectively. As we continue the development, we'll be heading towards a retransition, which, although the soloist is present, I am labeling Ritornello 3. Although typically the return of the P theme would herald the start of the recapitulation, and of course, you're welcome to think of this as the beginning of the recap, I prefer to think of these motifs of the opening 3 notes of the P theme as generative. This is music which is working. working to bring the reality of a tonic major recapitulation back into being. I've marked this whole section as a retransition, even though we are really about 20 bars from the beginning of the recap. Emerging as if from behind the cloud of arpeggios created by the piano, the horn ushers in the recap in this desirous key and begins the solo 3 recapitulatory rotation. Significantly tighter in its construction than the S1 exposition, the P theme is more closely related to the S interjection which opened the movement. The transition which follows has no clear start, and I've thus labeled it as S2 PTR merge. Although I wouldn't label this as a second R interjection, the secondary theme is a repetition of that section, again voiced only by the orchestra. Similarly, the transition which follows is the material from Solo 1's expositional turn away from the Ritornello secondary theme. The important question now is, where will we be heading? The sheer variety of tonal options available seems almost endless, but the most normative would be the tonic major, the most tragic, the tonic minor. The tragic option it is then. This reopening of the minor mode by the soloist offsets the potential acceptance of this theme again to the ending ritornello. The Deus ex machina, available to most soloists, the ending cadenza, has already been exhausted by Brahms in the opening of this work and will not be used again. The ability of the soloist to reach a cadence and the orchestra's choice to accept it or negate it are what success or failure hinges on. Although again, this structural cadence is relatively weak due to its elision with the closing theme, it nevertheless has strong correspondence to the structural cadence in the solo 1 rotation. But as you can no doubt hear, these closing zones are not simply celebratory, or in this case, perhaps lamentary, reiterations of the cadence. They are going places. Space is being opened for the ritornello's final word. Similar to Ritornello 3, Ritornello 4 is again going to include the soloist, but I hear this section as being driven by the orchestra. As I've said, Horton's analytical preference in his book is to continue the solo 2 rotation in the development all the way through to the final cadence. This ambiguity is what provides most of the expressive meaning of the late Romantic period. If you have a different interpretation of anything in this movement, or just want to voice your agreement or disagreement with my analysis, please let me know in the comments below. As you can see, similarly to what I labeled R3 at the end of the development, the piano is more textural than motivic in this section. We have the return of the ritornello's P-based theme, and it appears the second half of P1.2, which was actually missing from the other rotation's closing zones. Could this be an indication of acceptance on the part of the ritornello? As the closing zone based on P1.2 continues, it slowly tapers away, losing energy as it goes, and it's left to the soloist to reinfuse life into the movement to close it. Although these final cadential stingers, what we might call a brief coda on the movement, are certainly loud, I don't exactly hear them as the tonal closure one sometimes finds in romantic sonata forms. Often, Tchaikovsky's sonata forms similarly reach a tonal closure in codas that do not fill the gap of a failed exposition or sonata. The repetition of the triplet motive from the primary theme sounds to me as if it is struggling to bring a cadential gesture into existence. And though it ultimately succeeds, if you know how the next movement of this symphonic concerto begins, you know it's no picnic. Obviously, a piece of this scale includes near infinite possibilities for analysis, but I hope you enjoyed this analysis of the Type 5 sonata form of the first movement of Brahms' second piano concerto. I intend to do all the movements of this work, but as it took me 3 weeks to complete the analysis of the first movement, it might take a little longer than usual. Hopefully by mid-November, I'll have an additional movement out. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.